Hello from New Zealand. Today is the 11th of February, 2018. I've done a long series called Debunking the Myths about Childbirth, and they're in a playlist on YouTube in our Birthing Better Childbirth Preparation YouTube channel. Now I'm going to do a series on the childbirth truths, and today we're going to start with the truths around birth plans. As I've said in previous talks, I'm so old that I've actually lived through 3 evidence-based maternity systems and 3 childbirth systems. In other words, there's the delivery of service, how obstetricians and hospitals and midwives deliver service. So I've lived through 3 of those different changes, and how expectant parents approach their birth. So I've lived through 3 of those changes as well. And our charitable trust started between the 2nd and the 3rd in the early 70s. And we have not been able to have a voice within the childbirth conversation until now. Because when trends change, there gets to be a momentum. More and more people adapt to that change, and they want it to work. And when it doesn't work, then people are seeking another change. So between the 70s and the 80s, there was a change to the present trend now, which is about birth plans. So let me give you a very short and sweet history of birth plans so that you understand the truth about them. And this comes from an old lady who can tell you that when I gave birth in 1970, they didn't exist. So we were coming out of and still in follow your doctor's orders as delivery of service. In the United States, however, there was just the beginning of childbirth preparation classes that had started really in the 60s, and by the time I gave birth in 1970, Lamaze classes and Bradley, the Lamaze was taught probably in every hospital, in every town, every city throughout the United States for a period of 20 years. So there was a skills-based approach to childbirth and the viewpoint of how expectant parents were to approach their birth. And at the same time, that was overlaid with the delivery of service or an evidence-based practice that was follow your doctor's orders, that had standards of care. So when I gave birth in 1970, I went into a hospital. I had an obstetrician. There were no midwives in the United States. There were some lay midwives doing some home births, and some Vietnam paramedics who had come back and were doing home births, and of course some obstetrical nurses, and of course a few obstetricians or doctors. But by and large, everyone in the United States at that point birthed in the hospital. And we went in and we were shaved. We were given an enema. We couldn't get out of bed. We couldn't eat and drink. My husband was one of the first fathers permitted into the labor room, but not into the delivery room. I was then strapped onto the delivery table with my feet in stirrups, and I looked at a mirror, and I was given a mandatory episiotomy, and my child was lifted out with forceps, and then she was taken into a nursery. I stayed in the hospital for 7 days. She was bottle fed. Breastfeeding was not encouraged. So that was the evidence-based at that time. Also, cesareans were very infrequent because there were major abdominal surgery with your belly being cut from your pubic bone up to your belly button, and your uterus was separated this way, and you were given a general anesthetic. And there was no doubt that if you tried to have a vaginal birth after a cesarean, that was at risk. So women didn't have choices. But something happened because Lamaze and Bradley were the way that we approached childbirth. Prior to that, there had been no childbirth preparation or education classes. So I was born in 1944. There was nothing available to women who gave birth during that period of time until the early 60s. So what happened? There was this collision of women who were using Lamaze or Bradley techniques, and in New Zealand, where our trust is now, they were using the Grantley-Dick-Reed techniques, and fathers were coming in and they had some skills to help us cope. Women wanted our husbands to be able to come in and help us cope, because previous to that, we had been left alone. We had been either paid for a private room or we were in a ward separated by curtains. So you see that was a complicated time, but there was change in the air. Now, as I've said in previous talks, the greatest probably original sin of that first shift from how we as families approach birth was that the three obstetricians, Lamaze, Grantley, Dick Reed, and Bradley, they were very caring men, and they could see that birth was becoming more standardized around medical care, and they didn't think that that was okay. So they developed systems that were targeted to women who wanted to have a natural birth, a pain-free labor with less medical care. And that was the original sin, because the truth is that all pregnant women will give birth. And as long as you are conscious, you should have skills to do the activity of birthing your baby. So that was a huge mistake, and the focus of the childbirth classes were geared towards trying to avoid medical care. But there were these standards of care, so we couldn't avoid them. And if things changed in our birth and we had more medical care, we often stopped using the skills, because the message we had been given was that these early skills, Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley, Dick Reed, were targeting those women who wanted a natural birth, pain-free labor with less medical care. However, at the same time, the truth is that millions upon millions upon millions of women and men in the United States, at this change of 1970, obstetricians and obstetrical nurses saw these women using some form of skill and fathers helping. And it was because there was this millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of women and men working together in birth with all these standards of care that the medical profession began to feel more open about changing their evidence-based practice. At the same time, the people who were focused on skills achieving these normal, pain-free, less medical births, after a generation of those skills being taught, discovered that not enough women achieved those goals. And they didn't have the foresight. And this was the truth. And you can forgive them, but this is the truth of it. They didn't have the foresight to tie skills to every birth, every pregnancy. Because had they done that without these three goals and just said, you're giving birth, it's an activity that you are doing with your baby and with your partner, and you should do it with skills. If they had said that back in the 60s and the 70s, we would not be in the childbirth conversation we are now, because there would be a societal expectation that made sense that if you were pregnant, part of pregnancy is to learn skills so that when you do the activity of birthing your baby, you will use skills to birth your baby, regardless of where you birth, who is present, or what happens to you around you, as long as you are conscious and have not been given some drug that makes you incapable of using skills. So this was a huge mistake that people still have not come to terms with. And our trust, these Birthing Better skills, started to develop in 1972. So we could see the writing in the wall, the families that developed these skills, because the skills didn't work for all of them. And so they wanted skills that did work, and many of them hadn't learned any of the skills because they were not going to try for a normal birth. They couldn't because of their circumstances, or it was obvious, based on their obstetrician or the hospital they were going with, that they couldn't avoid the standards of care. So we developed skills for all births. But this magical thing happened. The follow your doctor's orders collided with this skills approach, this childbirth trend, There was a skills-based approach, even though it was narrowly targeted. Still, a lot of women learned these skills. So what happened once the birth advocates began to, my granddaughter just came in, so she's going to watch me talk to my computer. So when the birth advocates of that generation, hi Mila, say hi. When the birth advocates of that generation who were looking to have natural birth occur because of skills started to say that hadn't worked, they turned their attention then to changing the delivery of service, which was to give women choice. So by the time my last birth occurred in 1982, we had begun to develop birth plans. So those birth plans came from the natural birth advocates who were saying that, no, you can't put rabbit ears on me while I'm talking. So the natural birth advocates wanted women to choose less medical care. So birth plans were developed so that women could say no to medical care. I have to ask my granddaughter to just sit there if you're going to, okay? I don't want you to distract, okay? So that's okay, just sit, okay? So what happened was that women were using birth plans to try to say no to medical care. And with that, childbirth classes changed. Instead of teaching skills, because childbirth education began to say skills aren't working to achieve these natural, pain-free, less medical births, they were saying choice is going to work. So if you choose not to have medical care, if you choose not to have these standards of care, these assessments, this monitoring and procedures, then the medical profession has to honor your choices. And so birth plans began to be a vehicle for women to say no to medical care. And the original sin around birth plans was that as soon as you say to women, you can have choice in childbirth, you see what is happening now, which is more women are choosing elective cesareans. And because the medical profession shifted and changed, they also began to do less invasive cesareans because women didn't want to be left with a scar. So the reason we have low-lying cesareans is that women said to the obstetrical model, we don't want to be left with the scar, and we are now wearing bikinis. So can you hide the scar? So what obstetricians discovered through trial and error in the scientific way they do is that they could do a low-lying incision. And that is what's being done today. That also opened up the ability for women to start to choose vaginal births after cesareans. Now, the first women who did choose vaginal births after cesarean, which were called trials of labor, were women who had had classical cesareans. So birth plans were designed to say no to medical care. But then they became a wish list. And this is the truth of what birth plans are. They're now like check items on a menu or a wish list of what you want and don't want. And during the late 80s, what happened was that women began to think of everything that they wanted, whether it was, I want more than one person, I want this music played, I want it dark in the room, I want to have my baby put to my breast, I don't want to move out of the room, I want all of these things. And these birth plans became very long documents. And from the birth plans and the long documents of birth plans arose the shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, and frustration that has absolutely skyrocketed since I gave birth first in 1970. That just didn't exist. I'll tell you, the women of my generation, we may not have liked what happened when we went into the hospital, but that was what it was. We didn't think there were choices, which there weren't, and we accepted it. In fact, the birth, was not seen of, like it is today, equated to the wedding. It was seen of as the transition we did from pregnancy to becoming mothers and fathers. That's not happening today. People are looking at the birth as this highlight experience, and they're trying to plan this highlight experience. And often, the truth is that birth plans fail. But the truth prior to that is that women had so many things they wanted and didn't want that their midwives or obstetricians or the staff in the hospital really didn't know what was important. And women often didn't. And often a woman would say, I want this music played. And so everybody would get that music played. And then she'd get into labor and she'd go, turn that bloody music off. And you'd think, okay. But then what is she left with 6 months later? So let's say a woman puts on her birth plan, I don't want to have any pain relief. And she goes into labor and she finds the natural occurring pain of contractions very, very intense. And she ends up saying, I want pain relief. And her husband or other person who's helping her is saying, but you said on the birth plan you didn't want pain relief and you asked me to stand up for that. And she goes, you don't know what I'm going through. And so she gets pain relief. And then 6 months later, she's angry with her partner or other person for letting her cave in. So what happened with birth plans is they were a good idea, but they weren't used well. And it's hard to know how to use a birth plan well. What I've discovered after 45 years of being involved in births, hundreds and hundreds of births, and talking to tens and thousands of women globally, is that there is no way to plan your baby's birth. There is a truth. You never know what your birth's going to be like. However, it is also followed by an untruth. Therefore, there's nothing you can really do to prepare for it. So people have put birth plans as a way to prepare for it. But because there was this original sin where skills were not targeted to everybody, then nobody now is skilled because it didn't achieve those three goals of a natural birth, pain-free labor, and less medical care. But birthing better, when it started right away by families that said we should all be skilled. Every one of us, every pregnant family should have skills to birth our babies. And once we became skilled, we didn't focus as much on our birth plans. We might discuss with our obstetrician or midwife or even the staff what we might like. However, because we behaved, we coped, they could see us manage, deal with, stay on top of, and in control during our baby's birthing process because we were using skills and our partner and other person was helping us to use skills. They then, the staff, the obstetricians, the midwives, negotiated with us better around these standards of care or this evidence-based practice that was the norm in their hospital or the norm in their practice. So skilled families still impress birth professionals. That's what you need to understand. They saw millions in the 60s and the 70s, but then the natural birth advocates dismissed skills. So now they see almost no one using skills, which means they see and hear overwhelmed, freaked women and men who don't know how to help and are standing around or just being hung on. So the truth about birth plans is you need to have two of them. You need to have a conventional one that says what you want and don't want and make that list to really something that matters to you and know that that can still change. Second of all, if you don't get what you want, if you get nothing of what you want, do not use that as a reason to be traumatized the rest of your life. Just your baby needs the whole you, and your partner does, your family does. So you have to find a way not to carry the trauma or frustration of a birth plan not unfolding the way you want. But you want to create a second birth plan that is based on your skills. You don't have to elaborate beyond breathing, relaxation, teamwork, staying open, softening inside, preparing my vagina, willing to work, and well, I have every kind of fiddle that is. And then you tell your obstetrician, midwife, or the staff to encourage you if they see that you're not using skills effectively, and to praise you when they do see you using skills effectively. We must bring skills back into childbirth. It's absolutely essential. The cesarean rate is now 30% in most modern countries, even in New Zealand, where there is a midwifery-led continuity of care partnership where 90% of women have their own midwife. The cesarean rate has gone from 12% to 30% because choice has allowed women to choose more medical care, and because the philosophy of the midwifery movement and the natural birth movement is that birth is instinctual and women don't need skills. We need to become highly skilled. So how do you help our charitable trust? You go to our YouTube channel and see these playlists. This is the first one, so the playlist about the truths of childbirth will grow. Go to PayPal and give us a donation at info@birthingbetter.com. Comment on this. Share this link. Ask us questions. What do you want us to talk about as a charitable trust about the childbirth truths? So see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.